We can go to war over the issue very easily, I assure you. I won't go into that. The ethic of complementarity is based on an evolutionary notion. And
Evolutionary notion.
An evolutionary, not revolutionary, please. Be careful about words. It's based on the idea that ecosystems involve ever greater differentiation in which all the components of the ecosystem play a role in that indirectly or directly supporting each other as an ecosystem. That we don't only evolve as a species, we evolve within ecosystems. And how we function in ecosystems, whether we are consciously complementary or not, is, in my opinion, an ethic. Now, that ethic also implies that what is complementary? What is a complementary phenomenon? Is, for example, setting fire to the Amazon a complementary ethic? Obviously not, so far as all the denizens, the aboriginal cultures and so forth in the Amazon are concerned. But there has to be an ethic of virtue as well, of what is good. And what is good, and I wish to state this bluntly, out of an ethic of complementarity is what we as a species can most uniquely bring not only to each other, but to other animal life forms. What is it that we can give to the natural world that is creative? Not destructive, but creative. To what extent can we develop an ethic of that? And here I fall back on two fundamental ethical views that I will hold to the day I die. One of them is freedom, and the other one is consciousness, reason. Within those frameworks of reason and freedom, of consciousness and freedom, which is our unique gift, because we make ethics. We are the only ethical agents in the world. No polar bear is ethical. Nature can do nothing, will do nothing. If you're being torn apart by a Nazi, gassed, hanged, killed, or shot in the Second World War, or bombed, or fragmented, or torn to death, nature will still rise, the sky will be beautiful. The winds will blow gently upon your dying face and your contorted suffering. But nature will do nothing. We make ethics, and when we talk of rights, we confer them, because we are conscious beings. But I submit that we have thereby, if we are conscious beings, developed a sense of mutual responsibility toward the natural world, hence complementarity, complementing. And we bring what is unique to ourselves, just as a polar bear can bring what is unique to itself, just as a tiger can bring, just as other furry little things can bring. They all bring something unique. Beavers dam rivers and everything like that. We have reasons for why the world is the way it is, and we explain that ecologically on the basis of the attributes of each species. Our attribute is, above all, consciousness. We can generalize such as no animal, including the chimpanzee, which is only separated from us genetically by 0.2%. That's all. We are only separated from the chimpanzee, not by 2%, but by 0.2%. In other words, we have 99.8% of the genetic makeup of a chimp. And yet that 2%, 0.2%, is what makes us different from a chimp. Isn't that amazing? We bring that consciousness and we bring that freedom, and as I indicated, it would be a positive freedom, not a negative freedom. That ethic, which would require hours to elaborate, would form the ethic that I regard as a truly socio-ecological ethic, or if you like, an eco-anarchist ethic. Hence, complementarity does not mean authority. Hence, complementarity does not mean hierarchy. Hence, I'll tell you all the things it doesn't mean to show you why it's important to use that word complementarity. It does not mean domination. Complementarity means supplementation with what is unique and what you have to give. And I submit to you what people most uniquely can give is consciousness. And for themselves in particular, freedom. And the freedom is a positive freedom. And that must always be translated not into abstract terms like Habermas does. My nemesis. My nightmare. The man who takes great ideas and turns them into abstract formulas, into subjectivity, as just another way of talking of the public sphere. Why use the word into subjectivity when we're talking of the public sphere? You see what I'm trying to say? Academics can take the life out of anything. And this is, I was an academic. They can hemorrhage any topic. And I don't mean that they do so consciously, and I don't mean that academics do that consciously, and I was an academic. But I can tell you they can take the blood out of everything and talk, instead of talking the public sphere, they'll talk of intersubjectivity. So what does an ethic ultimately translate itself into concretely? Into the most magnificent polis and confederation of poli that we can create. Divested of that concrete form, an ethic becomes a pure categorical imperative of one sort or another, is not reasoned out, is not substantiated by history, is not dialectical. And that was at least one of the geniuses of Hegel, however much I disagree with what he would have called, quotes, the end of history. Do I answer? Thank you.
You had a question?
I just wanted to go back, step back a bit, to define or talk about a neighborhood somewhat related to the previous question. That what is it that makes a neighborhood? Locality, or a community of interest, or do we have some boundary? Like, I see this could be called a neighborhood, and yet it's empty at night. This
I know.
Here, it doesn't work here.
Pretty bad.
Did everybody hear that question? What is a neighborhood?
And particularly, how can you call this a neighborhood when it's empty at night and people seem to have no interaction with each other? And that's a big problem that we're faced with. The question is, we have not discovered that our neighborhoods, despite the fact that most of our neighborhoods are virtually desiccated today, you know, that they have been stripped of all civic meaning today, our neighborhoods do have problems that are at least comparable to the problems that used to unite workers traditionally in factories, and still very importantly, raise entirely new sets of issues, such as housing. Neighborhoods have very common issues about housing. Neighborhoods have very common issues about traffic. Neighborhoods have very common issues about how their monies are being used to service them and to service the larger community, the city of Montreal in which they live. The neighborhoods are very important ecological issues. They're very important ecological issues. In other words, they have very important ecological issues and educational issues. So there are things that can be focused around neighborhoods. And I can go further. If one wants to expand the issue, if I just took ecology alone and tried to show you that whether you're a worker or a middle-class person, whether you're white, black, or Asian, whether you're whatever religion, you're whatever background you may be, you have a very shared issue in the amount of poison you're breathing in the air and the amount of poison you're getting in the water and what's happening to your city, which is going to affect your neighborhood. And this doesn't make any difference what social class you belong to. These are trans-class issues. Workers were interested in two things. One, they wanted job security, and two, they wanted high wages. Capitalism ostensibly was incapable of giving it to them, although it has learned how to co-opt them. And now they have become essentially less class conscious than they ever were in the past 150 years. But neighbors have many problems that are beginning to loom more and more and more. Ecological issue being of paramount importance. But no less important, not less important, but of comparable importance are issues that range from education, safety, good housing, the amenities of life, which are everywhere being destroyed by urbanization. So I submit to you, and also storekeepers have issues in their relationship with customers. Women understand their neighborhoods, or used to until they were finally put to work, unfortunately, at slave wages. Women understood their neighborhoods far more dramatically than men did. There once was a time when the women did the shopping and the women took care of the children. And I'm not saying this is good, but I'm saying this was a way in which women got to know that there was a neighborhood. They went to the stores, they cooked the food, they needed cooperation from other women or neighbors in their own homes or in their own neighborhoods. And they belonged to various clubs and societies, including PTAs and whatever you like. They knew what a neighborhood was. Now what's also destroying neighborhoods are that we are not involved in our neighborhoods the way women used to be involved in their neighborhoods. And therefore it's not surprising that in the great insurrections, such as the great uprisings of the French Revolution, including the American Revolution, including the British Revolution, the English Revolution, all the way up through the 19th century, it was the women who provided the oil for the fire. Because they stood on the bread lines when there was a shortage of bread. They're doing it in Moscow now. They're doing it in, what do they call it now? Well, let's call it the other city. You know? I don't want to call it Petrograd, St. Petersburg, or Leningrad. So the other place I live, all right, near Kronstadt. Okay, the city that's off the Kronstadt sailors' neighborhoods. They're the ones who are mainly on the bread lines, waiting for bread and seeing what they can find. And our men are being driven to do the same thing because they don't have any jobs. Now, I'm not saying that women have improved their condition. I mean, I don't want women to go back to doing the shopping. I think the men should also do the shopping. They should do some of the neighboring. I call it neighboring. But you do have these common issues. You know, a worker doesn't like to be called... This is a very strong point with me because I resent it. I worked for 10 years in a foundry and an auto plant. Okay? I was a union man. I was a union organizer, as good old Dan was. You see, we're both of the Kronstadt generation. We were born in 1921. All right? I remember very plainly, you know, as a worker, how workers resented being called workers, except when they wanted to talk of themselves as the labor movement. What they wanted to be called were people. They were people just like anybody else was people, you know. They resented the fact that they were not fathers and mothers, that they were not considered as fathers and mothers. They were supposed to be a historical force. Marx said so. Lenin did everything to indicate as much, even though he never saw the inside of the factory in his life. Engels, who was a capitalist, by the way, for much of his life, said that they were a historical force. Workers were interested in being people. They didn't want to just be a historical force. They wanted to be fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, neighbors, affines of all kinds. They wanted to have a life. And that life was not confined inside a factory. A factory was a place you wanted to get out of. A factory was a place where you had to earn the means for survival in order to be a human being. And I may tell you, I am for post-scarcity. I am against an ecology movement that preaches the idea that toil is noble. It's not. I used to fall asleep when I finished the day's work, and when I wound up on the railroad, I wound up at the end of the line. And the railroad yard had to be awakened because I was so exhausted. It's not noble. I couldn't read, I couldn't think. It was amazing when I had a Saturday or Sunday off to be able to do something for myself. And when Sunday night used to begin to come, twilight, fear used to come into myself. I knew that Monday was going to begin for the next 5 or 6 days. There's nothing noble about it. And we must free people as much as possible from those survival forces called scarcity. And ecology movements that tell you that toil is noble, that we should have labor-intensive work, should go inside a factory or a coal mine. Oh, do I want to send it there. Because I've seen the inside of a coal mine and find out how ennobling it is when you cough up, as we did in the steel plant, cough up India ink in your phlegm, and you can't get the molding dust dirt off your hand for 3 or 4 years after you've left the plant for good. I don't want to hear about ennobling work, labor-intensive technology, or anything. Craftsman, personship, that's fine. I can see that. Gardening, very healthy. It's much better than jogging. Much healthier. And also very useful. Gets you into the food chain. You become part of it. The growing plant. You eat something that you have helped grow. I can see that. Composting, I can see that. Sparing, not using styrofoam, all the rest of that I can see. But don't tell me, and particularly a twit coming out of public school who comes from a middle-class suburban family tells me that toil is ennobling until you go through 10 years of a foundry. And I mean the kind of foundry, I'm sorry if I lose my passion. You know, I'm loose on this. You get on a damn automobile assembly line or get into a foundry and find out how noble it is to work 8 hours, forget about 10 hours the way they do it now. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Nothing infuriates me more than to be told that toil is ennobling and we should have a labor-intensive technology.
Eric, you know.
On another level, I wanted to know, well, you talked before about complementarity, and a lot of your writings on libertarian municipalism center around changing cities. And I'm wondering what relationship a city has to rurality.
As to what, please?
Rural areas.
Yes.
Do we consider them as heartlands? Do we consider them as something that's interdependent but autonomous just like the city is? I mean, what can we do with rural areas?
We're talking about a very strategic question.
Yeah.
First of all, the cities that we have structured right now have to be ultimately and historically undone. Because if we don't undo them, I'll tell you, they will be undone for us by ultraviolet radiation coming through holes in the ozone layer. They will be undone for us by tides rising up and hopefully drowning New York and other cities like that, particularly San Francisco and Los Angeles. Those 2 cities need drowning badly. At least cleansing. The Great Plains will be filled with water depending upon how serious the greenhouse effect is. So it isn't like we are sitting around talking about utopia. Nature is going to do it for us. If we don't destructure our cities and recreate them again, okay, in a way that is ecological and rational and balanced with the countryside, then nature will do it for us by getting rid of all of us or making us live on top of mountains while the water laps at the foot of the hills. That's another question. Now that's real. This is no longer 300 years from now. This is conceivably within the lifespan of younger people around here, to one degree or another. Not to speak of the impact of ultraviolet radiation on vegetation and the positive feedback system that may develop, that may very well make our atmosphere virtually useless, and we'll have to use Bucky Fuller's idea of living underneath domes. And he has that. I have a slide of him with a dome over New York City. Great imaginations, great minds, great naval engineers, great ecologists. We'll let that ride. Now, I'm starting with the city as it is now. And as it is right now, I'm arguing that it is not a city, and we have to make it a city. That's my contention. But I'm arguing that ultimately, if we do start moving in that direction, if we start in a momentum in that direction, through a political movement, ultimately the outcome will have to be, give or take, within 50 to 60 or even 100 years, or maybe 20 years. Remember that Germany, which was bombed into a hollow shell, and I remember that, where hardly a building was standing, Germany is now, within a span of 5 years, was totally reconstructed. Within 5 years after the Deutschmark was devalued in 1948, by 1953, Germany was now put together. And by 1955, that's how fascinatingly effective this technology is. Germany now became one of the foremost industrial producers, and today is now going to be able to do with the Deutschmark, with Bismarck and Wilhelm II, and Hitler couldn't do with bayonets. It's taking over Europe. And how long ago is this? So is it utopian to dream that we can destructure and recreate new cities? It's not. Cities, and we can discuss the population size, and we can discuss where they should be located. These are logistical problems, which not city planners, but really ecologists and geologists and soil experts and people who know wildlife and zoology can tell us more information. Information, they're not going to set policy, they're going to give us information. We will determine the policy. Then we can destructure the cities. And at that particular point, we can create a balance between town and country, in which perhaps towns of approximately 10,000 will be within walking distance of each other if you're healthy, roughly about 10 or 15 miles. Rousseau walked from Geneva to Paris, you know that? He didn't ride, he didn't sit there on a highway and thumb his way into Paris. He walked it. People did walking like that. Rabelais walked all through Europe. 15 miles, and I have hiked 15 miles in mountain country, is nothing. So we can have cities, communities of 10 or 20,000, 15 miles apart, each with its own countryside and interlocked with each other. Is that inconceivable? It's the most conceivable thing in the world if you consider that you're going to have cities underwater pretty soon. If you consider that people may have to put domes over these cities in order to avoid the dangers of ultraviolet radiation. If I'm utopian, then look at the facts. They are sheer science fiction, but they're terribly real. At that particular point, my ideal, and this is my ideal, it may not be yours, is to bring the countryside in great measure into the city, to green the city. This is not a new idea that sprang up, the bioregionalists out there in Berkeley. And particularly with that, what's his name again? Well, I forgot. Somebody may help me. Peter Berg, the Wunderkind of Oakland, of San Francisco. This stuff was advanced in the 1960s. Retaught obligatory technology in post-scarcity anarchism. You'll find that that's where it was advanced. Bring the town and country into a closer relationship. Not by dissolving the town, but by making the town, if you want to use the expression of the 90s, as green as possible. Bring gardening into the town, rooftop gardening into the town. Bring collectors into the town. And I don't mean the kind of windmill arrays that exist in California today, which are a horror to look at. They look as bad as Pittsburgh. Have you ever seen them? They're in huge geometric arrays covering hills. And they look like horrors, like industrial horrors. And this is supposed to be alternate technology. If this is alternate technology, I'd rather go back to an ordinary coal power plant. That's how horrible it look. No, I don't mean that. I mean also conserving energy, and very importantly, and this has not been sufficiently stressed by many alternate energy people, the need to create a form of housing that can withstand the rigors of summer and winter. And you know where you find that, oddly enough? In the very old buildings of Quebec City. Nothing amazed me more when I came to Quebec City in the wintertime. In 1952, when every third person was a cleric, you know, walking around with the casa. That's the way it looked to me. I thought I was going back to medieval Rome. And I went, this is 52. Many of you were not even born at that time, I suspect. Some of you may remember. Every third person was a cleric, a nun of one sort, or a priest, or a monk. And, you know, it was fun. And I stood in a place at that time, I'll never forget it, in which the walls made of fieldstone were approximately several feet thick. And they hardly had to use any heat. Body heat, believe it or not. Body heat more than amply supplied much of what you have to use today in the form of furnaces and so on and so forth. And in the wintertime and the summertime, they were cool. I went back again. Because they contained, you know what I mean? There was heat retention. There was, in other words, the mass necessary to keep the place cool. So actually you can use all kinds of technologies today to build homes and houses without these glaring and horrible solar collectors that I see, that only a technocratic monster can conceive of, where the sun hits you and blinds you. Have you ever seen that type of collector? You know, glass or cow wall clear across the whole roof, hitting you, you know what I mean, as though a space machine had landed and was about to send out death rays. You don't have to do that. I'm not saying you shouldn't use collectors, but I can talk endlessly about technologies we have experimented with at the Institute for Social Ecology, where we have had differences, the famous delta, you know what I mean, factor, differences of 80 degrees in temperature due to insulation and nothing else. Where the temperature went down to about 20 or 30 Fahrenheit, below 0 Fahrenheit, we went up into collectors that we had built into rock formations that had 40 and 50 degrees above Fahrenheit. And there was absolutely no heating system whatever. So the ideas that exist today are absolutely incredible. The literature and the extent to which we can ingeniously devise that, if we can talk about people who built a nuclear bomb, believe me, we can settle the problem of cities. If we can talk of Germany reconstructing itself in 5 to 6 years from a Paleolithic level clear up to one of the most highly industrialized countries in the world, in 5 to 6 years, who are we to stop talking? Why is it utopian to think that we can't decentralize New York, Vermont, and so forth, especially since the counties, the rural counties, are emptying now? Do I answer your question?
I'm wondering about how optimistic you feel about some of the, say, computer technology to bring about...
Computer technology?
Yeah, to bring about, I'm thinking of like electronic agora, to have...
Electronic agora.
Sort of referendum.
Oh God, no. I'm very much for using computers. I believe in them.
Okay.
I'm not one of these shy ecologists who says, oh, God forbid, give me nothing but a quill and blood for an inkwell. And I will write purely au naturel. If Gary Snyder, Mr. Ecology himself, deep ecology, the poet of ecology, no poet laureate of ecology, can finally announce some, what is it again? Coevolution Quarterly, now called our Whole Earth Catalog, devote a whole page to his new word processor and how he's really becoming self-sufficient by using batteries. Oh boy, what a simple technology. That is really living simply.
Well, what I'm referring to is more...
Please, but I want to get to the point that I want to make, because I want to use questions to answer other points. I believe that we should computerize as much as we can and do it intelligently. Just as we shouldn't, one laundry mat shouldn't exist in one kitchen. It should be shared by several families. It's absurd. They stand idle most of the time, okay? That type of American idiocy is not what I'm recommending. Computerization as much as possible to reduce labor and to free us to engage in politics and culture. But to answer your question immediately and directly, the push-button system is something that's horrible to me, because it is just like television. I do not know Bill Clinton, I do know Jerry Brown for other reasons, because many of my students worked for him in California when he was governor. And what they told me is nightmarish. That man shouldn't be running for anything short of cleaning the streets of San Francisco. But that's the sign. The push-button approach is literally the television approach. The television approach is dehumanizing. It's one-dimensional. I prefer, far and away, the idea of a face-to-face dialogue, a face-to-face conversation, so that I can familiarize myself with the person, so I can tell from body language, intonation, through questions, answers, and discussion, not through pushing the red button saying no and the green button saying yes. That's what I would say forms a real public sphere. Otherwise, you have an electronic sphere, and that is not public. It may be efficient, but freedom is not efficient. Totalitarianism is supposed to be. And I don't want to see that replace the body language, the contact, the protoplasmic contact, and all its different aspects that are so necessary for really forming a community, and thereby forming an agora, and thereby forming an assembly. By the way, you know what came up with that crazy idea? Of all people, the French situationists. I don't know if you know who they are, as opposed to me.
Nicholas. Yes, I will ask my question in French and Eric will translate for me, but make it clear for everybody if you don't mind. Bon, ok, je vais. T'as dit pendant l'exposé,
You said during the expose
que, ok, il y avait un problème, c'est-à-dire que la bureaucratie ne se réduit pas seulement aux fonctionnaires et aux bureaucrates, mais aussi à toutes les personnes qui se trouvent à médiatiser les rapports entre les individus dans leurs conflits, dans leurs problèmes.
You said during your expose that bureaucracy...
Expose or
I imagine what
During your presentation.
During your presentation, your lecture, that bureaucracy is not only the
bureaucrats. Ah, mais ça, plus que ça, c'est avec les psychologues.
Okay, you're saying that bureaucracy extends to the whole, everybody, to all the people that mediate relationships between people. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
the professionals is what I'm talking about.
Right.
Now let me make that clear. Is that the question?
Ok, j'ai pas posé la question encore. Ok, maintenant, justement, où est la frontière entre un service rendu par quelqu'un qui a un métier et qui offre son service à la population de son quartier et quelqu'un qui est un bureaucrate qui finalement est médiatise les rapports entre
What's the boundary, okay, between a bureaucrat, somebody that mediates in relationships between people, and somebody that works in a neighborhood to help, let's say, a public sphere appear? I imagine that would, or even just offer services, that he, you know, that. Yeah.
All right. The bureaucrat that you are familiar with and that you normally call a bureaucrat is the person who handles governmental affairs and regulations. That we know about. The bureaucrat who applies building codes. You got to get a license to build something. You got to get a license to drive a car. You got to get a license to breathe. You got to get a license to be born, to die, and everything like that. Whether you do it or somebody else does it, there's a bureaucrat for it. And then there are bureaucrats who are scattered all over the place, who supervise this and supervise that, and so on and so forth. They are pulled out of public life, okay? And they are given jobs. But how many dollars a year? I don't know. 30, 20,000, 30,000 or more, okay? Minimum. Those people we know as bureaucrats, and we know that they multiply like cockroaches, to be very frank with you. They recreate functions for themselves. They divide up and redivide up their functions. Those are public bureaucrats. Then there are the private bureaucrats. Who are these people? These people are people who put up a shingle and say, I'm an astrologist, and I will tell you your fortune or your future. Or they put up another shingle and they say, I am a job counselor. And they're usually located in schools and other places, and I will tell you where to go to get a job, or how to train yourself to get a job. Or I'm an education counselor, or I'm a marital counselor. You want me to go through all the counselors you can possibly be today? They number at least 1,000, at least. And by the way, they can't prepare licenses fast enough to license them. I'm a shaman. That's the latest kind of counselor that's going around. I'm a witch. That's another kind of counselor. I want to really get into the bizarre, you know. I channel with a caveman of 30,000 years ago, Shirley MacLaine. She's got a pipe into the Paleolithic. That's another kind of concept. By the way, there's a whole bunch of book writers will tell you how to do it. From committing suicide to becoming ethereal and losing your body and becoming a pure spirit. We know all about these people. These people are professionals no less than people who license your dog, people who bury you, people who give you certification that you were born, who say that you are a citizen, and finally give you your whole pedigree and everything you need to work your way through life. Now, what is the difference between that and, say, somebody who goes around and tries to help in the community? Such people are normally not professionals. If they are professionals, they're problematical. They can be as dangerous as they can be helpful. But insofar as they are not professionals, they are people who are trying to do something for other people. They're part of the mutual aid network. It is not a job, it is a calling. It's like people who go around and give out leaflets or pamphlets or try to persuade you. I would not call a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses who rings your doorbell and tries to tell you that Jehovah is here, or I would not try to say that a person who tries to tell you that Rabbi Schneerman out in Brooklyn is the Messiah and he's about to arrive, I would not call that a bureaucrat. That is a person who's trying to persuade you and who's trying to help you. A bureaucrat is somebody who collects money for a specified period of time to do a function for you that you have lost your either competence in doing, and that is the problem. You've lost your competence in doing. In other words, you have adopted or have been persuaded to adopt or have been forced to adopt a crutch, a stick to help you walk in every aspect of life, on how to fornicate in bed to how to make friends with your neighbors. You see, from every aspect. That, to me, is a bureaucrat, whether licensed by the government. Usually they're licensed. That's the interesting thing. They're licensed. Okay? That particular point, what has happened? The organic nature of your life, even as an individual, forget about being a social being, has changed. You now no longer feel that your mind is capable of doing anything more than following the advice of other people who are paid to give you that advice. That's the first thing. The second thing is that they usually work within the status quo. This is the reactionary side of it. They tell you, don't look at the class struggle. Don't look at tyranny. Look inside yourself. You are responsible. There's the ecological bureaucrat who tells you what to buy and what to eat because it's eco-capitalism. You understand? If you buy toilet paper that's been recycled 400 times, then you're a better ecologist than one who has bought toilet paper that has been recycled 2 times. Okay? If you go ahead and you, for argument's sake, should happen to eat the wrong way, or you eat up on the food chain or you eat down on the food chain, that's the ecological bureaucrat. But the main point is that there are people who are merely dealing with you as a client, just like a bureaucrat deals with you as a taxpayer. The relationship is fundamentally different. It is not that they are really involved in you, they are involved with how much you pay per hour. Sometimes their advice is good, as I tell you, normally their advice is introverted. Compared to that, people who ring doorbells, who try to help, who are sent out to help the infirm and sick, who cannot help themselves, not who have not learned how to help themselves, but cannot help themselves, are in my eyes no longer bureaucrats. Now the line is a gray zone. You can shade from one into the other. The visiting nurse is not a bureaucrat, insofar as the visiting nurse is visiting somebody who's incapacitated. On the other hand, the perpetual friend who comes around, or the supervisor to make sure that you don't commit a crime because you're on parole comes around, or the truant officer who comes around is a bureaucrat. Those people are not concerned with you. They are concerned with enacting and making sure that certain regulations that the state creates are being followed. And that invasion of your life spells out 2 things. Not only that your life is now under scrutiny and being searched, it also spells out the fact that you are becoming more and more decapitated. That is to say, more and more segments of your brain are being surgically cut out and frozen. Your capacity to make certain judgments becomes atrophied. Before long, they even made a movie out of this, I understand, with Bill Murray, The man couldn't live without his analyst, so he follows him through to a vacation spot and finally drives his analyst crazy, and the analyst wants to kill him. Okay? I don't remember that movie. When you find a person in that position, that person really is problematical. Because what has happened, I'm not finished.
Right.
What has happened is that you have been diminished intellectually and mentally to a point where you can only do a few things, and thereafter everything that you should be able to do, either with the support of people who care for you, the community that cares for you, you are obliged to rely on a specialist to do. And that person now becomes a bureaucrat, and that person's main concern, however well-intended, is principally how much you can pay.
Okay, now for some people, this is a rather important question. And then the answer perhaps has to be nuanced a little further. There are people in this room who are community organizers or community helpers, call them what you will. Lucia Kowalik is one, Claudette Gottlieb is another, there may be others. And this distinction, the so-called gray zone, has to perhaps be drawn out to be fully explained and fully understood. So I invite either one of you or both or others to put forward your conception of this role that people play in communities to develop services or programs or a sense of movement for social justice, etc., etc.
I was going to ask another question, but I think the commentaires sont appropriés dans un sens. What I was going to address essentially is that I agree with a little bit of your vision on the role and the necessity to organize ourselves and to control our lives within the neighborhood. I don't necessarily agree with you still, partly that the city is dying or dead. I think there is still some vitality left in it, and that a lot of us work very hard to maintain our neighborhoods and therefore to maintain our city. I agree, though, that City Hall or City Council is an administrative machine, a rubber stamping process, and it is ruled from the federal and the provincial government. My question, and I think, when you gave your talk last week, when I was younger, I used to do the cool class 6, so I felt like I had a crash course in classics last week. And it reminded me, in a sense, when I went back and I said, yes, Athens, they even figured out the atom, and they had a lot of things that were figured out, and then we went through in civilization 1,500 years, and then it took the Renaissance. And is it possible that we've accumulated so much knowledge and experience in the last 400 years that our 0.2% difference between us and the chimpanzee cannot assimilate that? And that we are somewhere along the line on a self-destructive process, and we are going to need to self-destruct a little bit more before we say, okay, we have to readjust. That's one reaction or reflection that I have, which has been at the back of my mind for weeks. And
let me answer that first, so that then you give me the second reflection.
Okay.
Is that agreeable to you?
Yes, yes.
No, I want you to give me asking 2 questions, if you don't mind.
No.
Let me say that I was a community organizer. I helped organize a rent strike. I was in the Congress of Racial Equality and so forth. And there were community organizers whom we paid to engage in this work. This came from the neighborhood. This came from the community. This came from people who were involved in the community. I'm not talking of that. I'm not talking of you or Lucia. I'm talking of the person who has a shingle outside and is going to tell you how to live your life for a half hour at $50 an hour, or maybe $100 an hour.
Yes, I realize that.
You must understand what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about people who go out and organize rent strikes or try to see that people get their services and see that they get their rights from the bureaucrats. I'm talking of a different kind of more, quote, spiritual bureaucracy that I know of. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking of those who tell you they'll channel you, or they'll give you a reading, or they'll look at your palm. That's the most coarsest example. More subtle example are those who give you anything from advice on how to marry, marriage counsels and everything like that. People should be able to settle the problems of their marriage without going to a counselor. If they are going to a counselor, they are slightly crippled. It's not that the marriage is crippled, they too are crippled. And this may sound very offensive, but I am not objecting to people going to marriage counselors. That's fine. Let them go if they need it. I know that there are people who definitely should go to psychiatrists, including all 4 candidates who are running the primary in the United States. That's a separate question. I'm not saying that you don't go to certain people who you do need. You go to a doctor. I wouldn't call him a bureaucrat, although he easily can become one. We know that. What I'm talking about are subtle forms of bureaucratization that we do not often include in bureaucracy. And those are people who rely on the fact that we are, in one sense or another, being crippled by the society. Not that we're sick, not that we're disabled. I need help. I can't walk, and my walking arthritis is going to get worse. So I want you to understand, I don't mean by a community organizer or a bureaucrat. What I mean, okay, now let's get down to your question. Are we becoming destructive? Is that the point? After all these years and because of our big brain. The real danger is not that we are becoming destructive. There is always an elite around that is becoming destructive, that's for sure. That I know. They join armies, they become generals, they fly airplanes to big red hot rock music while they're machine gunning and bombing civilians, and namely the so-called Republican Guard and caravan that was retreating. Do you know how they were bombed, those people, that whole array of Iraqi vehicles that you saw, that great miracle that Bush performed? That was done while they were listening to hard acid rock. And they were saying, now I'm going to zero in on that one. Watch this go, fellas. Hey, yes, boom. I'm not joking. I heard the tapes. Hard acid rock in the airplane. F-617, firing missiles, firing rotating machine guns, what are they called again, John? Gatling guns, we make them in Burlington, we know all about them, 5,000 bullets a minute, you know, bombing and laying waste. That's what that is the destructive side. Okay. You know what most people are today, and this is unfortunate. What has been developed in them is neither the destructive nor the creative, unless they get into certain professions and fields. What has been developed in them overwhelmingly is, I repeat, the adaptive side. If the mind has any biological function, the most immediate function is to guarantee survival. To guarantee survival under a set of given conditions, or to modify those conditions to guarantee survival. That is its natural evolutionary function. Go through the animal, quote, kingdom, look at the language that's being used, go through the whole tree of life and examine how the nervous system and the formation of different brains and finally cerebrum has developed for the purposes not so much of destroying, or even for that matter of creating, but primarily adapting, sometimes involving a measure of creation, however unconscious, sometimes involving a measure of destruction. Now the object basically is that a fulfillment of the brain? No. But that is certainly the most immediate biological function of the brain. So I don't believe that the size of our brains, and that 0.2% difference between us and chimpanzees, has anything to do with destruction or creation. I think its most fundamental feature is adaptation, and the object of any great movement for social change is to evoke the creative side of the brain, which is there. Otherwise, we would not have all of this. You know, we'd be in caves here. So, it's adaptive, and that's what I feel. My feel is that people will accept this system as being natural, and they'll always adapt. They'll adapt to the worst until finally they're in the sewer, when finally they are homeless, they'll live in cardboard boxes, and finally when they are starving, they'll eat dung, or whatever they can eat paper. And if they're lonely, they'll make friends with spiders. I'm serious. That is the real problem that we are faced with. It's not a question of destruction. That's there. And it's not a question of creation. It's there, but it's being subdued by the adaptive function. Now, what was your second question?
The other question that I had was very much in terms of local politics, where many of us have a shared vision for many years that if we had that's a neighborhood representation, that people would participate, and that we would start this democratic process within our neighborhoods, and then we would bring it to City Hall. What has happened, in fact, in our city is the contrary. City Hall has brought the democratic process to our neighborhood, but it's a false democracy. It's, you know, If you're lucky, they listen to your questions, and if you're very lucky, they answer your question in a partisan way. So this exercise, I personally feel, is much more dangerous than no exercise at all, because it disgusts people and it discourages real participation in any political process. And my realization is that the bureaucrats, or the civil servants, or the professional statesmen, who are also citizens in our neighborhood and people who live in our neighborhood, are not willing, and our majority, and the majority also men, are not willing to share their power. They have the power, they control the knowledge, and they will only give you a little bit of it to keep you from fighting them.
You're talking of City Hall.
Yes, yes, for our purpose, yes. And when you were talking about the friendly face government versus Stalin, it is, they do it here with a friendly face, but it is manipulation and control, and to a certain degree, abuse of power. So how can we really and honestly encourage citizen participation when always it is ideological battles and power struggles that people have to confront all the time?
Yeah. And that is, you're talking
And when in the end we
co-optation.
delivered the whole popular movement to the MCM.
What did you say?
When we delivered the whole popular movement that was built up over years to the MCM, who then turned around and gave us half a loaf.
It's
Oh,
not
no.
yet, however.
That is a problem that exists everywhere. Listen, and I know there's a picture of Montreal, it's a picture of all of Vermont.
Yes.
Where I live, in Burlington, Vermont, we had Bernard Sanders, became mayor, and took half of our ideas and used them and said, why are you opposing us? We said, what about the other half? Now the question is, what does the other half mean? That's the point. The point is, first of all, let's face the fact, as I said, people tend to adapt. Let's face the fact that if we tried to start a movement going, only a small minority would participate. And yet we would be talking about participatory democracy in which only a fraction, 1%, 2%, if you're lucky, 5% if you're lucky. That's true. And I'll tell you very frankly, there's no answer to that question, because it requires other processes than just starting a movement to get people active. We have to create a political culture, but a political culture is not created just by a movement. A political culture is also created by history or events. The 60s did not come about because in Berkeley they decided they wanted to use a four-letter word in 1964. And the movement did not come about in the 60s because the CND was marching up and down England at the time. The point is that things were happening in addition to what these movements were trying to do. Events work. And those events required, in the minds of many people, deep concern and solutions. Now the question is to make people aware, at best, of events and to educate them. But that does not a movement make. It doesn't make a movement. A mere awareness. There's always that one half that has to be resolved, and that has to be accentuated in mind. There is the question of a party consciousness, and that can only usually be done initially to a very small number of people. That does not mean you're not being democratic. Your door is always open. That's the point. The sections of 1793 would, at a moment of great events, would swell up to 1,000 people coming to a sectional meeting. And in ordinary days, when still important things were happening, but they were not great events, would contract to 30 people. The same section. 30 people. So it would be like an accordion, going back and forth. And what determined how the accordion went back and forth was primarily external events. Events that impact upon people, that make people feel, I'm mad and I have to do something about it. And then after, they begin to relate from one movement to another. So what am I trying to say? Sum it up. One, the business of creating consciousness, of making people aware, of getting them to know that there are alternatives to the system, and of indicating the irrationalities of the system is an ongoing fight. It's an ongoing battle. And often, the battle produces very few results. If one expects a new idea is going to produce a magical change in people's consciousness, remember that it took 100 years for the Enlightenment to lead up to the French Revolution. And most of the people who were in the Enlightenment, from Voltaire, if you like, clear up to Denis Diderot, whom I most admire, never even saw the French Revolution. They were to die before it. Okay? Rousseau, whose name was to be invoked throughout the French Revolution, never saw the French Revolution. He died years before the French Revolution. That isn't the point. The point is there has to be an enlightenment. That's number one. And that has to go on. It's a ceaseless and thankless struggle, but a vital. The second thing is, there's always that 50% they do not give. And that 50% has to be completely brought out into the open, because it has to be shown that what they are giving is the least effective of what you're demanding. What they're giving you is meant to quiet you, not to satisfy you. And even if it means a drop of satisfaction, it's never enough. And that has to be heightened. And the third thing is, you must continually work at the business of creating a political culture so that when the time comes, historic events begin to move. Social, the movements, the movement of people now begin to be able to turn over in bed, as the saying goes. At that particular point, a movement must be in place of the kind that we have tried to discuss. Must be in place because they're going to turn over in bed. That I assure you. The big problem we're faced with in the United States, just to give you a case in point, and I don't think you're quite faced with in Canada or Quebec, is that now Americans are becoming bothered, terribly bothered. But the traditional good old Marxist, Leninist, socialist, Maoist, left, Trotskyist, Stalinist, that left is only used to the centralized state. People are demanding more power. They want to place limitation on congressional terms, that you can't, they want to kick everybody out of practically everybody office now because of the bank scandal that you must have read about. I can't, I have so much to say. The people want to move right now, and they're moving, they could move potentially in a more and more decentralist and confederalist direction. But that wretched debris, that detritus that remains from the 1960s, alas, with its now having gone into the academy and becoming professors, with all due respect to the professors around here, and now turning from students into the very professors they fought when they were young, and telling exactly those students what their professors told them 30 years ago that they shouldn't do. That detritus that remains around here has to be shed. And a movement has to be created that can countervail this, and can now begin, when they turn over into bed, to prevent the right from taking it over. Because what's happening in the United States is that exactly socialism is identified with the nation-state and centralization. The breakup of the so-called Soviet Empire, it was never one anyway, but an empire it was, has made many people recognize that there is something wrong with the traditional left. What has to be recreated now, if you want to call it a new left, or you want to call it a new movement, or whatever you want to call it, has to be confederal, and it has to appeal exactly to people at a time when the right is using these very decentralist arguments to establish racist organizations, to establish semi-fascistic organizations. One thinks, for example, of the Lombardy League in northern Italy, which is beginning to take over cities in Italy, gaining, 20% of the Milano?
Brescia.
Huh?
In Brescia.
In where?
In Brescia.
In Brescia, 20%. And you know who they're promoting? Proudhon. They literally study Proudhon. And they're racists. And they're semi-fascists. And that they're calling right now is for the decentralization of Italy into a Lombardy League, basically of German origin, which will keep these Sicilian southern Arabs, or North Africans, as the very expression they use, out of Lombardy or the northern Italian cities. And what's happening is that the socialists and the communists and the otherists can't address that. You know why? They believe in the nation-state. They believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat, or if they modified it, they turned it into one or another form of statism. So the right is taking over. The David Dukes in the United States, the Pat Buchanans, too much government. Give power back to the people. America first, and then after America is Northern European, and let's get rid of everybody else. You see what's happening? So one of the greatest failures is that, stuck as we are with a statist conception of socialism, it becomes impossible to advance a decentralist confederal form. If I were to talk about confederation at the Socialist Scholars Conference, they'd look at me and say, what has that got to do with Marxism? And they're right, it doesn't. Marx was a statist, avowedly so. He wanted the unification of Germany and the development of nation states. And Lenin was even worse. So what are we going to say? There's the problem. That's why we need something, a movement, that will free itself, unshackle itself from that Marxist status position, that will be communitarian in the South, and will be not right-wing, but left-wing in its direction. Otherwise, this, what I'm talking about right now, is going to be accepted 50%. And you know by whom? By the right. And we're already seeing among Greens ecofascism. We're seeing among Greens and ecologists right-wingers, people who are working with the capitalist system, and people who very significantly are working with the centralist ideas the way the Lombardy League in Italy is working. This is a very serious problem. That is what has me more frightened.
I just want to make a brief comment. Your question was very good. The answer was confusing because I think the issue was confusing. I don't think it's an easy question to answer, but it's a good question. What I'd like to speak to is a little bit is the model that Murray presented, which is a wonderful model of, you know, going this way and so on, which we all believe in. But even that, in a city of 3 million, looks overwhelming. It looks discouraging. I think if any of us sitting in this room who says, yes, I believe in this, now where do I start? Well, I guess I better get my whole neighborhood, 1,000 strong, to come to such and such a meeting and we'll start discussing. Obviously, it can't work that way. It's not going to. And so it just looks very discouraging. So it seems to me that the only possibility for each of us who cares is to still break it down more into smaller and smaller parts. I think that Claudette's absolutely right. There's plenty of energy, lots of it, where people still keep saying, no, I'm not going to accept that, and I'm going to try to do this, or I'm going to try to do that. I'm not talking about fragmented actions where people just go off in all directions. I'm talking about, I think that the kind of vision that Murray speaks about is a vision that we can keep in our mind that maybe will happen or maybe will not, but that we can take a small enough component, whether it's a street, whether it's a group of people who want to organize for a service, whether it's people who want to take over their community center and run it, whatever it is, that we try to use that model. We start as small as we have to. That we use the model of looking at other small groups. That the model is usable, that we just have to start very, very small, or we feel completely overwhelmed and we don't know where to start.
Can I respond to that, please? And I do that with warmth, love, and friendship, but I disagree. It's not that I completely disagree. I believe it's better to do that than to do nothing. But I will tell you right now that if you don't have a larger vision of the changes that have to be made, in view of the ecological problems that are not simply raining on us, but literally beginning to deluge us, if we don't see the historic developments that are taking place today, the overwhelming prospect of a thermonuclear war in the Middle East, don't think of Russia and the United States. That's over with. I'm talking of Israel versus Syria, or Syria versus Iraq, or Iraq versus Saudi Arabia. And God knows, and there's going to be nuclear weapons all over the Middle East, not to speak of other countries. And that's where one of the worst dangers lie. If you do not see, or one does not see, not you specifically, if one does not see not only the magnitude of the ecological crisis and the distribution of weaponry, but today the extent to which the major powers are forming empires in the form of European communities, American communities, which are potentially can be very antagonistic to each other, very antagonistic to each other. If one does not see, in addition to that, the continual emergence, particularly in Europe, but increasingly in North America, of an authoritarian right, if one does not see these developments and does not include that in the vision that you're discussing, then I think we are running very grave risks. I think we have to think big because of the size of the problems. Now, I'm not suggesting, incidentally...
You hear what I said. I said that you have to think big about it.
Yeah, but then you also have to do big. That's
Well,
what
then,
I want. No, I really.
people who are going to do nothing, Murray. That's what
No,
happens.
I
because
understand.
It's much too big a job.
Lucia, I understand what you're saying, but I want to say that it is not that much of a big job when one considers the magnitude of the problems, or else one will not do enough. Now, what am I suggesting? I'm not suggesting that one goes around and just simply immobilizes a neighborhood, important as that is. I'm going to cross the green line, as the saying goes. You know, they used to divide the Christian from the Muslim section in Beirut, and the one that the Israeli from the occupied Arab. I'm going to cross the green line, and I'm going to say we have to run candidates on this program for city councils throughout Canada and throughout the United States. We have to put people up who are going to address, and people who are guided by the communities in which they belong, who are going to call for changes in city charter, changes in the whole administration, in short, very radical changes. In other words, establish a dual power to the central power that exists in Ottawa or that exists elsewhere in Canada. Okay? All these central powers. And if we don't cross that green line, we're going to become, as unfortunately, we're going to be doing what Christians tried to do for 2,000 years with a notable amount of failure, win person by person and bit by bit. And what happened in point of fact was that very little was ultimately achieved. Nobody is turning the other cheek. I realize that nowadays anyone who calls for participating in municipal elections is regarded as some kind of socialist or a parliamentarian. I draw a very strong distinction between parliamentarism on the one side and municipalism on the other side. Parliamentarism means literally going into parliament with a view toward working within the system. Municipalism means working exactly on the next local level that you can operate on, that closest to your doorstep, that which is closest to people, not with a view toward working within the system. And by the way, and I hate to say this, garnishing it and making it more acceptable by giving it a human face or broadening its smile, but working against the system by demanding a basic revision of city charters and re-empowerment of the population. That is what I mean by crossing the green line. I am not talking of becoming a parliamentarian. I'm talking of recreating the city council as a kind of new commune and being a basic opposition within that city council, leaning on the communities from which one comes and addressing communities that form part of the city. In other words, to reconstruct the city and the very politics of the city itself. That's what I think is very important. And I break with any so-called anarchists who find the full expression with spray cans, making A's or B's or C's and circles around them, or shave their hair and leave a mohawk color haircut and paint it red, white, blue, or purple, or black and red, taking mean to think of me, or believe you should go into the factories and work for the rest of your lifetime for the noble proletariat, which has been a signal failure, and believe in individual self-expression to such an extent that as Proudhon moronically said, anybody who raise a hand on me is my enemy, who don't like institutions, which is ridiculous. Without institutions, you will have no self-governance. Forget about anything else, you'll just have chaos. But having said that, crossing the green line, because I realize how many sensibilities I might offend by saying this, and I've said this internationally and offended a good many sensibilities from Italy to England. That's another question. But the point is that we must go into the public sphere, whatever we consider ourselves, in the public sphere, and the most immediate public sphere of a community is not going to be a local housing project. It's not going to be a small community center, important as it is for that particular area. It has to be a public sphere that embraces the city as such, whether the city has 100,000 people, whether the city has 35,000 people, or whether it has 8 million people. Forget about 3 million. You've got it easy here. Think of New York. Think of Chicago. Think of San Francisco. Think of, above all, Los Angeles. That's what I feel is utterly necessary, and that's what must be debated. It must be debated. Because I will not allow myself to stay on the other side of the green line any longer and watch libertarian ideas in the best sense of the term, decentralist ideas in the best sense of the term, green ideas, become more and more co-opted by the establishment, with no new politics whatever to offer. The German Greens have gone down the drain. The British Greens will probably go down the drain. The Italian Greens, I don't know where the hell they're going. I don't know what's going on in France. It's a chaos. It's high time we had a coherent policy, and that's what I definitely emphasize. So I'm suggesting that people in this neighborhood should run councillors for the city council.
they did.
Yes, you seem very skeptical about the 12 steps groups, but social ecologically speaking, isn't there something inspiring? Isn't there something, you know, these gatherings of people helping to learn each other, and it's very costless. These people learn to share responsibilities. They learn to run meetings. They are kind of fed up of the psychological stuff, you know, in some way. They say, well, we're going to help together. So isn't there something inspiring in terms of spontaneous social movement besides, let's say, the ideological, you know, basis? So I know you criticized that in your speech. I would like you to elaborate on that.
And they're all volunteers.
Yes, there's, you know, something, there's a grassroots, you know, taste in this kind of spontaneous movement. And it's very dynamic, you know, there's thousands of people in these groups. So maybe it just paved the way to something new, you know.
Well, I've had this problem in a special way, and I'd like to clarify it quite honestly, if you don't mind. Is that all right? I think alcoholics who have a problem with alcoholism should join Alcoholics Anonymous if that's the only way they can deal with their problem. I believe that. I'm not criticizing that. Sure. I think that people who are facing death, for sure, should join some kind of hospice, you know what I mean, and get all the help they can, whether it's 12 steps or 25 steps or 1,000 steps, assuming they have enough time to go through them. I believe that people who feel that they want to end their lives probably will need all the help that they certainly can. I believe that psychiatrists are eminently necessary, and I believe that group aid of the kind that you're describing is eminently necessary. What I object to is that this is a social vision. That's what I object to. The people I have seen coming out of the 12-step programs have a glazed look. And not only do they have a glazed look as though nirvana has finally come to them, and I'm not trying to put that down. Maybe a glazed look is better than tumbling around the street with a gin bottle. I'm not going to argue that. They have a glazed look. But very important is that this is seen as a social program. And I find that that is very, very unattractive, if I may say. And I'll tell you why. To be very specific. The object is not to get you to adapt, to be normal. To be normal today is bad. Because anything that is normal today is very abnormal. In an irrational society, if you're obeying the rationality of that society, you are being irrational. And people who walk around today after being therapized and now know how to live their lives are doing the worst possible thing. They would do better allowing for medical things like alcoholism, allowing for dietary problems, allowing for hospices and things like that. But people who walk around and preach a message of nirvana through 12 steps so that they can live within the system and, as they call it, function, are very dysfunctional. Because the system is dysfunctional. And if you can function within a dysfunctional system, and 12 steps has helped you do that, you really should look in. The you is not you. I'm not the you, I'm talking of one. Should look in to what is the real problem. What is the real problem? Not how to live with a problem by burying it on the 12 steps. That's my point. My point is that when someone comes out, like Shirley MacLaine, and she's not a 12-stepper, I know that. She's got crystals on the brain, okay? And she can channel into the Paleolithic. Or when Gloria Steinem can write a book on how she's achieved the ultimate in life, she has finally made contact with her inner child. At that particular point, she has become deactivated, she is dysfunctional, and she thinks she is functional. And the fact that her book is today a bestseller, such that when we looked at it, we couldn't even find it in the bookstores in Berlin. It was sold out. It's now #1 on the bestseller list, namely, How to Be Privately Private. That's her ultimate now in feminism. This great feminist activist, whatever she was. That, to me, is not adjusting, dealing with the society. It is doing the worst possible thing. It is adapting to the society. And that's what I find objectionable. I don't find Alcoholics Anonymous objectionable. I don't find hospices objectionable. That's not my argument. My argument is that if this is going to bring you a solution to your problems, namely by getting in touch with yourself and get you to live within the society instead of fighting the society and feeling angry about the society, then at that particular point, such programs are, in my opinion, wonderful ways to bring you inside the system. And when Rudy Dutschke, the famous radical lefty of the 60s, said, we have to make the long march into the institutions, and a lot of people followed him before he got drowned in his bathtub. He did. It's not a joke. It isn't even funny. He did. But before he got drowned, he went into the institutions to go through the long march. You know what happened to them? They got lost in the institutions. They're all there right now in Germany. They're in the institutions. And they're working to give capitalism a more friendlier face than ever. And that's what's happened with most of the Grünen in Germany, who have now reached the middle age crisis. But I don't want to go into that. That was my objection.
Okay, I hope that was clear. Anybody else had a question who has not posed a question yet? Give everybody a chance? You had, sorry.
Yeah, isn't that the same thing that's going to happen if the vehicle that we use is municipal politics? I mean, it actually has happened.
I know that. The point that I'm talking about,
The Montreal experience.
the Montreal experience is, I can't speak to the Montreal experience because I was not part of it. I have at most a fragmentary knowledge of it. But I can talk about the Burlington experience, okay? And the Burlington experience was that we elected a socialist mayor who became a socialist congressman. And now we have a technocrat in there who tries to look like a socialist, but he always looks like a business manager. Okay, his name is Peter Clavel, and he's a kind of nice guy. You can talk to him. And what happened basically is this, that they went ahead and they co-opted part of the program. And they gave us a this and they gave us a that. Problem you faced, 50%, 25%, even 60% sometimes, but never 100%. Okay, unless the 100% was relatively honest. Now, how are you going to keep people from doing that? How are you going to keep people? First of all, these people to begin with, who may have taken over the MCM, did not even believe in the original program of the MCM. My understanding is that a lot of people got into the MCM, and I wish somebody who knows the story about it can talk about what the Social Democrats and others did in the MCM to virtually make the MCM quite different from what it was originally. That's number one. But the second thing is, how do you avoid that happening to anyone? And here I can't give you any other answer but consciousness, education. And that's the reason why now, when I work on a political level, and I'm now 71 and I can work less and less on a political level, I work with study groups. It's not affinity groups, study groups. We sit down and we examine exactly how this co-optation takes place. And we tell there's no regulation that can prevent somebody from betraying something. All you have to do is turn around and say, no, I no longer associate with this organization now that I'm in the city council. How can you stop that? That has happened over and over again. Now I've decided to become a member of the NDP, or I've decided to become a member of the MCM, or I've decided to line up with this faction or that faction. Nothing can guarantee that from happening. But the nearest thing you can do is to try to develop consciousness and to try to develop proven people who finally you feel will not do that. But they can always do it on the city council. And they can always do it in any kind of so-called quasi-governmental agency. However, this should not deter you from trying to get out into the public sphere. It's high time that radicals who don't believe in parliamentarism, and rightly so, stop hiding in a closet called anti-parliamentarism, and thereby regard any dealings with any kind of institution, including a city council, including a neighborhood council, as being compromising and working within the state. If you're going in, this particular municipal organism is not the same thing, and I tried to develop that in great detail in the book, as a provincial organism. A municipal organism is, even in a city of 3 million, closer to the people than any provincial legislature, and certainly than any federal legislature. Your MPs are one thing. They're 1 million miles away so far as you're concerned. And in the United States, literally 3,000 miles away. Okay, they're down in Washington on the Atlantic coast, and they live in what's called the Beltway. They live in a self-enclosed world of their own, and their main dealings are with lobbyists. But at least in the city councils, you have a first the first political step, the first arena in which you can stay relatively close to the people. You know that at least people will know that you have betrayed, and you have to answer to a group. And that group is the neighborhood in which you live. It isn't 400,000 people. You know, Vermont has only one representative to the House of Representatives, and he represents close to 500,000 people. And we know him, you know, because we have, as our mayor. That's one thing. But most Vermonters don't know him. And how many people who support him in California know anything about him? So I'm talking of the difference in scale. Person who comes from the neighborhood, at least, assuming that such a person is conscious, assuming that such a person has been tested, assuming that such a person has been an advocate and has fought for a certain body of ideas that you've come to believe in and trust, and for good reason, goes into the city council to challenge the city council, and to challenge the structure of the city charter, and to challenge the provincial government and even the federal government, and demand autonomy of cities, and goes around and speaks to other cities nearby Montreal, and tries to present a message there. At that particular point, okay, that person is at least under your control to the degree that that person lives in your neighborhood, that that person can be talked to, that that person can be challenged, that that person has to answer to a constituency personally, not through television, not through radio. Bush's constituency is only through television. Our congressman's constituency is mainly through radio and television, and the press. Sanders does not live in my neighborhood. Sanders represents Vermont. And by the way, Vermont, you could put the population in about 1/4. It's only 500,000 people, 450,000 people. And yet, Sanders to me now has become an abstraction. Imagine what it is to have somebody from New York State or from California with 24 million people. You see the difference? I have a representative, for argument's sake, when I lived in New York, called Joe Schnugo. Okay? Joe Schnugo lived out in Brooklyn, but Brooklyn never saw Joe Schnugo. Joe Schnugo spent his time in Washington. If he went to Brooklyn, he had to talk to 500,000 people in order to be a representative, or more. He had to talk to closer to about 700,000 people, because there were only 400 or so representatives in the House of Representatives for 250 million people. Do you see the difference in scale? Do you see the difference in responsibility? Do you see the difference in control? That's the point. Then what else can you do? We can fold up our tents and go out into the desert if we can find one. But I tell you, if we do not cross that green line, we are private figures. We are marginalized. If we do not cross that green line, we are marginalized. We will be in a closet. And that has been the fate of the whole libertarian movement for 150 years. And I'll tell you, as a good libertarian, one who believes in decentralization, one who believes in the resubstitution of the state, the substitution of the state by a confederation, one who believes in local and grassroots democracy, and in the communitarian society, and in an ecological one, I am tired of the utter failure of staying locked up in a closet and being utterly righteous. There's nothing I love more than marginal people who yell out, "Freedom now!" And then you ask them, what is freedom? Get rid of the police force, get rid of any kind of organization, get rid of any kind of structure, let me do whatever I want. I'm sorry, that is to me not an answer. No institutions. But I'm institutionalized, I have 2 eyes, I have 2 kidneys. Without being utterly organized right now, I would be called what the medical profession would say is a sick man, right? I am utterly coordinated, I hope. As I get older, I'm getting less coordinated, but that's another problem. Okay? That's called aging. I'm tired of that. The failure, and finally when people who are afraid of any kind of electoral activity, I'm not talking of parliamentarism, people who finally are afraid of it do become a force, as happened in Spain. Believe it or not, they wound up in the government. One of the anarchist ministers became the minister of prisons, and the other anarchist minister became the anarchist minister of health, and was working for the Republican government. Go ahead.
You had a question?
No.
No? Further back.
Yes, you stressed throughout your whole talk the importance of education. And
I can hardly hear what I'm terribly
You
sorry.
stressed throughout your whole talk the question of education.
Yes.
The importance of
And
it.
I wondered whether you could perhaps elaborate a bit more on where this education starts. Are we talking about taking education out of the institution? Can students in a university take the initiative working within the university, or is this something that you feel should occur outside of these institutions? And also, could you also address the apoliticization of students?
How to what? Politicization?
Apoliticization.
The depoliticization.
Apolitical, not depolitical.
Empathy.
Of students, especially in the universities that we're witnessing today.
I can, first of all, I think that you should try as much as possible to take them out of the institution, because for me education is still a process that I'm engaged in. And I'm 71 years old, okay? I've been through a number of the institutions, and I've been through other things, but to me I've been educating myself as long as I've been alive. The real question is, when do you think you can ever stop educating yourself? And my response to you is frankly never. To what extent should you take them out of the institutions? A student is an abnormal creature. I'll be honest with you. There's something wrong. There's something as wrong with being a student as there is wrong with being disabled. Because a student goes through the university and then feels that he or she is educated. That's very far from really true. The tragedy of life today is that many people reach 30 and they think that they have nothing else further to do but to advance within the corporation. They walk around in a circle, and before long they've dug enough of a trench by walking until they're buried, and that's the end of it, nor they have the least That is called not being realistic and mature. I don't regard that as being realistic and mature. I regard that as frankly committing suicide, at least intellectually and spiritually. Now, getting students out of an education is merely a beginning of starting a better education, getting them out of an institution. Not in the sense that you take them out, get what you can out of them. I mean, the best place to learn chemistry is in the university or in a school, admittedly. The best place sometimes to learn languages, maybe in a school, I don't know. The best place to learn certain things. But get them the heck out of the sociology departments, with all due respect to sociologists, the political science departments, many of the psychology departments, particularly those that are anchored in, still anchored in conditioned reflexes. What's his name again? Skinner, and the rest of that garbage, and working with rats rather than people. And get them into real life situations, and then try to form a community that goes on, if possible, for a lifetime. And there are friends I have had who have educated me and whom I have contributed to, you know, for 20 years or so. The student, however, as I know the student, is generally a gypsy. You know, they're going through school and they're going to get out of it. They usually leave the locale in which they are studying. And tragically, unlike Latin American students, and unlike, at the best of times, the French students in '68, and unlike many other European students, the North American students are essentially carrying a knapsack on their back and waiting for a diploma. And that to me is not educating yourself. So my suggestion is one forms a study group, and one tries to form a community out of that study group, and really try to help develop people as well as develop oneself as part of a study group. You know, I gave examples of that when I talked about the Greeks. I'm sorry, you may not have been here. I don't know if you were here last night. But the university, the Lyceum and the Academy were not places that people went to get an education. You know how long Aristotle stood with Plato? 10 years, until Plato died. And it was after Plato's death that Aristotle left the Academy to form the Lyceum. And many of the students who studied with Plato and studied with Aristotle in the Academy and in the Lyceum, which were really part of a gymnasium, where young boys could listen to the ideas that these men had to develop and educate them and almost take them on as father figures, if you like, and even enter into, at times, sexual relations with them, which is not the point. The point basically is that that intimacy developed. Well, lifetime experiences. They were lifetime experiences. We don't have that today. We don't have a beloved teacher. We don't have a beloved place where we learn. We don't have a beloved body of people who formed a coterie around Socrates and wanted to go into exile with him when he was sentenced to death. They wanted to leave Athens with him. He refused because he didn't want to break the law. There was a principled reason for his actions. But imagine that there were 7, 8 young Greek Athenians, maybe 10, who wanted to go into exile, and the door was kept open for him because they didn't want to give him the headlock. They didn't want to kill him. They really didn't. He wanted to die for philosophy, partly. He was looking for martyrdom. That's beside the point. That kind of situation you don't see. And that's what we have to, in some sense, not on the Greek level, I don't think it's possible today, but in some sense recreate.
Could you describe the economic life that would accompany this collective self-governance of the community?
Ultimately, we would call for municipalization of the economy to the extent of the not nationalization. That's Stalin. That's Lenin. That's Marx. Not syndicalist trade union workers' control. That's proven to be something that the capitalist class can use very effectively today. Volvo gives workers control of hiring and firing, gives them control of their production schedules, and they work themselves to death to be loyal employees. Please, the company is not my partner. You know what I'm saying? The board of directors are not my teachers. No, not workers' control, and besides which many workers don't even want control. I know that. They want to get out of the factory altogether and go home, where they really can begin their lives. Municipalization means that the municipality takes over the economy, bit by bit, and then coordinates it through confederations with other municipalized economies. That means, for once, that the citizens, as citizens, qua citizens, you follow me? Not as workers, not as professionals, not as doctors, lawyers, and so on and so forth, but now truly as citizens, as it were, turn the economy into a truly civic enterprise. And the decisions are made collectively, not out of the self-interest of printers who want to get more out of a thing, not out of the potential fragmentation of interest that would come with workers' control. Not to speak of nationalization of the economy, which leads to a strengthening of the state, a reinforcement of the political machinery, I don't word political, the state machinery by the economic machine. That's what Stalin brought to its ultimate conclusion, and that was the tragic effect of much of the nationalized enterprises in Europe. Do I answer your question?
Other questions or comments on the economy?
So are there jobs for everyone?
Of course. Well, the most important thing is that there's more leisure for everyone. That's the point. The point is if you can put in 1 day a week, or distribute your hours as you like, and vary your work, that would be marvelous. And we hope automatic machinery can take over most of all the work. And by the way, it is happening. The assembly line is disappearing.
Democracy needs time.
Okay, how does this municipalized economy allows me as an individual worker to do my own job for myself?
There are several ways. The Greeks had wonderful things. First of all, you can do your own work by yourself if you want to, because you'll have the free time. I told you I believe in post-scarcity and the greatest degree of mechanization that is consistent with an ecological society. Obviously, I don't want nuclear power plants. Obviously, I don't want giant concentrated plants that destroy a whole ecosystem, in fact, may destroy a whole region, that pollute the air and everything like that. But, as I tried to indicate into our liberatory technology, which was written nearly 30 years ago, and is now becoming a reality, we now have a degree of versatility in technology that has been unparalleled in all of human history, and even unparalleled in all of the 20th century. That's what we can do today. That's beside the point. So how do you choose? Well, the real question is, how do you choose the owner of this work? Let us say that there are people who find they have to shovel something. They have to shovel shit, okay? As General Patton once put it in 1943. Okay. So what do? One of the ways we can do it is through sortition. The lot. That's fair. We rotate it. That's another way of doing it. Okay? What if you want to do, and you want to work at a particular job? Do it on your own free time. Work at it. Nobody's going to stop you. If you feel like digging coal, please don't let me keep you from doing it. I'm being playful. Fourier had a wonderful answer to all of this. He said, children like to handle dirt, so they'll take care of sanitation. If some people want to dig coal, I for one, would say I'd encourage them. If some people want to go around and climb up trees and set dynamite sticks to knock down giant, forgive me, old growth trees here and there, geriatric trees, okay, do that. If you feel like working in an assembly line, where an assembly line is needed, you want to push a machine aside and do it yourself, because you know the machines are taking over the assembly lines. And I knew that when I visited the River Rouge plant in 1967. The Ford River Rouge plant, where you pour in coal, and you pour in limestone, and you pour in ore, and out toward the end, allowing for a few other things as you pour in, comes a finished car. That's how self-sustaining and complete it was. If you want to work on the assembly line, I saw 2,000 workers breaking their back on an assembly line. Do it. Now machinery can do it for you. So you're free to choose whatever work you want to do, yes. And there are certain responsibilities to the community. Yes, and that will have to be determined. Those concrete details can be worked out. No problems. If anybody thinks that can't be worked out, then how do you conduct a whole war in a cold desert storm, bringing together within a span of 3 months 500,000 troops, the supplies to support them, on top of that, everything that is necessary to maintain another army in case you have to send them back again and then bring them back and forth. If that can't be done, if that can be done, you can do anything.
You had a question.
That kind of effort is very capital intensive.
Yes, I'm in favor of it.
It implies a lot of, in my mind, a lot of exploitation
What?
behind the raising of such capital. The type of vision that I hear you talk about, I've read in a book called Third Wave by Alvin Toffler.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gone through an engineering degree. I know about automation. It's very complex. You can't do it without a lot of money. Can you be more clear about what you're putting forth?
First of all, I've got a lot of training in engineering. I went to RCA Institutes and studied intensively engineering and electronics in the 1940s on the GI Bill. The Army paid for that. I've also studied a good deal of civil engineering when I was a structural steel detailer, so I know a great deal about that stuff. That's the thing. And I've also worked in the industries, not just simply sat at the drawing boards and went to the classes, okay? And I understand your question. I have news for you. We'll abolish money. Then we'll have all the capital we'll need. We'll abolish money. We'll abolish the market and monetary economy. If that isn't the goal, then we're going to keep capitalism going, and we're going to have the same mess that we have today. If we retain a market economy and we retain a money economy, then we're sunk. Because what's going to happen is we're going to compete with each other. And not only that, there'll be plenty of capital, but the capital will be destructive of the ozone layer, it'll be destructive of the climate, it'll be destructive of the soil, it'll poison the waters, and it'll poison the oceans, and poison the air. That I can assure you. So we'll have to abolish money, ultimately. But in the meantime, we can inch ourselves forward on a municipal level. For example, there was a real attempt to save farmland, and rural areas and cities will buy up if they can get the money. And they should be permitted to get the money, because most of the money goes to the central government, which really squanders it. Really squanders it. But that's the initial step. The ultimate step is to abolish money. And to stop thinking in terms of capital and start thinking in terms of what things are in terms of their use and what people need. By the way, I would say that at this particular point it would be wise if we went on diets and stopped eating most of the crap that people eat today. And we could cut back on a lot of wastage, including newspapers, which destroy forests endlessly and tell you nothing but bargains you can get. For me to open up a newspaper today is to read 3/4 ads and 1/4 news, and the news is pretty distorted as it is. And then when I go around and I look at people who have a television set in every single room, and a VCR in every toilet, you see, because they can't leave that screen. And when they must have a washing machine that can service easily 8 families, but they have to have it for themselves, including a dishwashing machine, where you have to wash the dishes before you put it in the dishwashing machine, and the rest of that insanity that today marks modern consumption, I would say that at that point, along with a rational society, you would have rational consumption. And then there is the question of the versatility of machinery, which, as an engineering student, are you mechanical?
Civil.
Yeah. What?
Civil.
Civil. Well, in mechanical engineering, almost anyone who's familiar with what is going on in machinery today should be aware of a revolution. You can now do what I suggested in 1965. You can put in a small bit in a machine, and an automated machine to boot that is programmed and can work 8 bits at one time. You know how machinists work today? They press a button and they walk away. You know that. By the way, how many people know the great industrial revolution has been taking place in only the past 20 years, while most of you were born and alive? It's incredible and unbelievable. Incredible. First of all, I worked in a foundry where the temperatures went up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, or 135 in August. I used to take salt tablets every 2 hours. I saw men fall out, collapsing of heat exhaustion. I saw people getting burned by molten ore, okay? Now, you know what a foundry looks like? A foundry, you sit in an air-conditioned room with paneled windows, and you have a computer, and you wear a white coat, and the air is fresh and even oxygenated to make you feel good. There, you work out the computer, and all of this stuff happens that men used to pull and lug and throw into pig iron molds and everything like that. That is being done with an expertise that no human being can do. You know that, folks? That's what a foundry looks like today. I'm not talking of my kind of foundry, the one that I worked in. You know what an auto plant is beginning to look like? It is only a matter of time before there'll be 3 or 4 people walking up and down an assembly. The use of labor today is purely to make profit. And that's why they search out many of the auto plants, those areas where workers will work for $4 or $5 an hour. Do you know what agriculture could be like? Even organic agriculture. But that isn't the point. I think organic agriculture is good for your health. As I said, it's better than jogging. Orthopedically, it is far better than running with sneakers up and down the road and walking into a car. So I think this dancing movement, which the Greeks actually did in the form of calisthenics, can now be done in reading, organizing, mixing, and getting into the food chain. Then you are part of the food chain, and your fecal matter goes back after being duly sterilized into the earth again and becomes compost. And it smells like perfume. Are these things, everything that you're laughing at is not only real, but it's more than everything that I have told you. More than I have told you. Far more than I have told you. What I'm telling you is the news of the last generation. You should see what's on the horizon for the next one.
Okay, now, I think the time has come to
cease exploiting me.
He has earned his fare. And to thank him very much, and to remind you of 2 things. Number one, that Murray directs, or teaches more exactly, one of the most